bunch of background information. The story doesn't actually
recording.
start till page 6.
Can you tell me how to stop it?
We're done.
That button right there.
That's easy enough. Okay. Thanks.
Other than what? Yeah, reading page 23, 38 in law.
You were worried to me.
All right, as Carter is going around and passing out index cards.
On the way.
Yes, on the way, please. Passing out index cards, I'm going to tell you guys what we're doing today. So first, I would just like to issue a reminder that your essays are due Monday morning. Not Monday night, Monday morning by 7:25. So there's that. Your homework for tonight is to read pages 23 to 38 and Raising the Sun. I had someone ask me, what about pages 1 through 23? It's just background information that the story doesn't actually start until page 23. So I'm not asking you to skip anything that is violated. Before I start talking about what I want to talk about, first I want to ask you, what do you think of when you hear the phrase "a raisin in the sun"? Yes.
Wrinkly.
Wrinkly, yeah.
Like long summer being exhausting.
Yeah, exhausting, wrinkly. I like these adjectives. What else? Yeah. Heat. Yeah, something here? Sticky. Yeah.
Great,
Grape?
great,
Yeah.
plural.
Grape. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about it might have been a grape before.
Yeah, it might have been a grape before it was a raisin. Do you have something to say, Quinn?
Yeah, like
Yep.
a raisin dry up in the sun.
Yeah, a raisin dries up in the sun. All these adjectives, sticky, wrinkly, dried up. These are all kind of going to be metaphors for our characters. They are raisins in the sun. Maybe once grapes, however, their circumstance, that heat, maybe makes them feel wrinkly and dried up, exhausted. So we're going to learn a lot about their circumstances and circumstances of that time period. What causes them to be the way that they are. We have very interesting characters in this book. Everybody very, very different from one another as a result of their circumstance. So we are going to figure out why that is. So first I want to go over who is Lorraine Hansberry, and that is our author. She often writes things that mimic her own life. So that's called autobiographical writing. So I want to learn a little bit more about her, and it'll help you understand why some things happen in the book the way that they do. Then we're going to talk about redlining in Chicago and Rochester. If you don't know what redlining is, it's okay, we'll go over it. That also has affected Lorraine Hansberry, and she writes about it in this book. This book is fictional, and this is a fictional family, but Hansberry writes about things that really happened to real people in 1958. And then we're going to read an article about all this stuff and answer some questions. Okay. Okay. Let's check. What are we doing with this? I will tell you when we get there. Okay. There we go. So this is our author, Lorraine Hansberry, on a playbill, and she is the writer of a play. Just to give you a visual, she's also one of your books. So she was born in May 19th, 1930. Her family lived in a black neighborhood in the south side of Chicago. Chicago at this time did not have legal segregation, but there was housing rules and laws put in place that inadvertently segregated people. Chicago was divided sharply into white and black neighborhoods because of these laws. Yes?
I wouldn't say inadvertently, I'd say it was purposeful, but
It was purposeful,
No,
but
it's
to the
written
public
out.
it was made to seem to be inverted. But it was a purposeful move on the U.S. government's part. which I will go over. I will show you a map that was drawn up by the U.S. government when they planned out how they were going to place these neighborhoods. Hansberry's writing is often autobiographical in nature, like I said, so a lot of things that happen to her in real life are going to show up in this book. She is credited with being one of the first black playwrights to create realistic black characters for stage. By this I mean, before this play came out, a lot of black characters on film and in media were made to adhere to stereotypes that didn't fully encompass who these characters may be as people. With the characters in our book, we're going to get to know a lot about who these people are, their dreams, why they have these dreams, what makes them tick, who they love and who they hate. We're going to get a full characterization of each person in this book. A Raisin in the Sun received the New York Drama Critics Circle Award for Best Play of the Year. Hansberry was the youngest playwright, 5th woman and first black writer to win that award. Hansberry died at the age of 34. That is very young. So that picture I showed to you at the beginning would have been what she looked like at the time she passed away. She died of cancer in 1965. I think it was like uterine cancer, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. Also, fun fact, Lorraine Hansberry was part of the LGBTQ community, which is also difficult in 1965. So Hansberry's family was one of the first black families to move into a white neighborhood when she was a child in the 1940s. She was 10 years old at that time. Hansberry's family faced threats, discrimination, hate, and legal action taken against them for buying this house. Finally, Hansberry's father brought their case all the way to the Supreme Court to be able to keep their house. So the idea that we are going to be going over that was legal and was able to bring this case all the way to the Supreme Court is redlining and restrictive covenants. So redlining is a plan that the U.S. government constructed with neighborhoods throughout the United States. They took the neighborhood and they said this is going to be, the outside skirts were usually the desirable areas where banks were willing and ready to give mortgages to with low interest rates that mostly white families would move into almost exclusively. And usually in the middle of that city is where they would place black families. They wouldn't give these families mortgages. Or if they did give it to them, they were at very high interest rates. So this created forms of segregation. I lost my train of thought. But yeah, basically what happened, I'm going to show you an example of that on the board of kind of what these maps look like. I'll also show you the difference in mortgage insurance and interest rates between maybe a white family and a black family. The black family ends up having to pay almost 2/3 more over time than the white family does for the interest rate on their mortgage. A restrictive covenant is written into the contract of a home. It could be written by a realtor, a bank, a mortgage broker, and it will say, families of color cannot move into this house cannot be sold to a family of color. Right in the contract of the house. And that often restricted the neighborhoods, who could move in there and who could not. So with that being said, I'm going to show you how these ideas existed in the setting of our book of Chicago, because it will affect our family, the younger family. And I want you to get an idea of kind of what the family that we're reading about would have been facing.
Between Black, white, and Latino Americans.
Oh, sorry.
But Chi-Town,
While this video is playing, this is where your index cards come in. While this video is playing, I'd like you to write down a question, a reaction, a thought, something from your own brain that you want to put down on paper about what you're learning about. Please don't write a summary of what you're watching in the video. Just give me a question, reaction, a thought, maybe a connection, a question you might have about what's going to happen in the book, etc.
is also one of the most racially divided cities in the United States. Most of these ethnic groups live in different neighborhoods separated by geography.
Segregation is like air and water. We just live it, we just breathe it. We don't really think about it. It's just sort of how things are.
I wanted to find out how Chicago got this way and how its segregation led to so many of its problems.
I will be collecting
Chicago's
these cards
segregation
within
is
the
best
class.
explained on a map. You have your north side, you have your south side, and you have your west side. To the east is the lake.
Those terms, north, south, and west, have subtle meanings that relate to the racial segregation of Chicago. And so when you say the north side, people are sometimes subtly meaning the white side. And the south side, especially today, is predominantly black. And so when you say the south side, you are subtly meaning the black side.
Chicago is very territorial. Like for me growing up, it was, okay, I know not to go to Bridgeport. Like this is a place that's not really welcoming to African Americans.
This geographic segregation is no accident. It was engineered over years of deliberate policies. In the early 1900s, Chicago was largely a city of white immigrants. The Great Migration of the 20th century brought millions of black Americans out of the violent Jim Crow South hoping for a better life. By the end of the 1940s, nearly 500,000 black Americans lived in Chicago, mostly in a small corridor on the south side called the Black Belt. As the black population increased, they faced housing practices that were completely racist, and yet completely legal. One of the worst was a practice called redlining, which allowed banks to refuse home loans to black residents wanting to move into mostly white neighborhoods. This happened to cities nationwide, from Chicago to Oakland to Baltimore. Realtors and homeowners signed restrictive covenants saying they wouldn't sell to black families in those white neighborhoods. And after World War II, the federal government subsidized white veterans with low-interest loans for fresh new homes in suburbia, complete with big yards and highways to get there.
The federal government was basically saying neighborhoods that are racially integrated are high-risk neighborhoods, and so we're not going to insure those mortgages in those neighborhoods. So they were supporting a suburbanization that led to predominantly white suburbs and predominantly black urban neighborhoods.
Meanwhile, realtors often participated in shady practices.
There were brokers that would go into a block and they may move a minority female with her 4, 5, or 6 children into a 2-bedroom house. And they would go down the block telling folks, well, they're here, your values are going to depreciate, your daughters will be raped, and which meant now what we can do is we can help you get out of here before it's too late.
Brokers would cheat those white homeowners by buying those homes at a low price, and then turn around and cheat the black homeowners by selling them those same homes at an inflated rate.
So as you can see, these are complicated topics, which is why I wanted you to kind of jot down some of your thoughts on an index card. Sometimes it takes some writing to process. Do you have questions that you want to ask me? No? That's okay. You can put your question on your index card. However, we will see some of these issues in the book. So like when the video says, sometimes they will place a black mother with 6 children into a 2-bedroom house. Well, in our book, we are going to see about a family of 6 living in a 1-bedroom house. What kind of conditions might you imagine for 6 people living in a 1-bedroom house? Yes, Carter?
Limited space.
Limited space, yeah. Yeah,
I was gonna say crowded.
crowded. What might happen as a result of that crowdedness? Yeah.
Disease.
Disease, yeah. Get sick easily, it's probably not very clean. Remember that this is the time before TVs, cell phones, and home air conditioners. Yes?
We want to do it outside.
Yeah. You would have more space outside than in your own house. It's Chicago in the summertime in our book, so it's probably very hot. The point is that the conditions are not very good and it's probably very uncomfortable for these people. And they all react differently in this uncomfortable situation. Now I'm going to show you a few examples of how these things manifested right here in Rochester, because like the video said, these policies were implemented across the United States. So on this slide, this is an example of a restrictive covenant that Kodak put in place for the neighborhoods that they were developing and building. And this restrictive covenant said, it's underlined in that red, but I know it's hard to read, so I'm going to read it for you. No lot or dwelling shall be sold to or occupied by a colored person. So as they're building this house and they're writing up the contract for this house, they place a covenant in there that says that no person of color is able to live in this neighborhood. Two more examples, and around the code in gates, building houses. Again, those restrictive covenants. The dwelling shall be occupied by the persons of the Caucasian race only. Again, stopping people of color from being able to move in those neighborhoods. And then gates. Says the same thing. This land is sold on the express covenant that it shall never be occupied by a person of color. And this is one of these maps I was referencing earlier that the government would have drawn up. This is what housing looked like for African American people during this time, 1940s, 50s, into the 60s. So this is where the red part, this is where African American families were permitted to live, and this is what their houses would look like. Projects, very small spaces, fitting a lot of people in one area. Again, creating those uncomfortable predicaments. This bright green area on the outside, these were the areas that banks would definitely give mortgages to. So low interest rates would definitely give mortgages to. These were blessed areas in the bank's eyes. These are like mid-tier areas. Again, still predominantly white areas. So like Hansberry's family, maybe if a black family did move into these areas, they would be harassed and things like that. But the banks still would provide loans here. The banks wouldn't provide loans here at all, or if they did, they would be at very high interest rates. I'm going to show you a key of kind of what those colors mean. And kind of give you an idea of what the numbers are like, because I know you guys are 16 and you're not buying houses, so these ideas might be a little bit over your head. So, those bright green areas I was talking about, those are considered first grade areas that had the federal government's full blessing. These are usually new or recently built neighborhoods on the edge of town that were virtually free of African Americans or foreign-born life, quote unquote. Lenders were encouraged to offer the maximum amount available in these A areas. And then we move down to the yellow bit because that is what's on our map. Third grade areas were colored yellow. These were older neighborhoods with housing styles that might now be out of fashion. Often neighborhood covenants had expired, and of course these areas were subject to infiltration of a lower grade population. When they say lower grade population, they mean people of color. And then the Deem neighborhoods is going to be that red area that I pointed out to you in the middle. Deem neighborhoods were usually struggling for survival. Red was the color used to indicate these fourth grade areas on the map. And thus, we got the term redlining. It was a racist assumption of the area that when minorities moved into a nice neighborhood, property values for the entire neighborhood would decrease. And that was their reasoning for having these restrictive covenants and not allowing certain people to buy houses. Sorry, I lost my math. I don't think I did it on the last period. Give me 1 second, technical difficulties. Alright, there we go. Okay. So in this scenario, that I have up here is 2004, so it's not 1950 right now. But Mr. Black receives a mortgage, and so does Mr. White, for the same price, $200,000 over 30 years. However, Mr. White gets a 5% interest rate, and Mr. Black gets a 10% interest rate. Mr. White's monthly mortgage payment is $1,074. Mr. Black's monthly mortgage payment is $1,755. That is a $681 difference because of the high interest rate. Someone take out their phone for me.
Me too.
Two people actually. So Carter and Claire. Okay. Can you do 681 times 30
Times 12.
times 12?
681 a month.
681 times 30 times 12 actually. Sorry. I'm an English teacher.
245 cents.
2,172. Yes, so that is how much extra money Mr. Black is going to pay compared to Mr. White over 30 years because of the poor interest rates and not being able to move into these areas. The bank's rules, he's going to pay $200,000 more than Mr. White over his 30-year mortgage. So that's kind of how the math works out. That's kind of how the people were affected. Yeah, so that is all I have for background information. If there are any questions before I move on to the next thing, questions or comments or any of those things? Yeah, no. Urbanization, it's nicer, aesthetically nicer for you to be out on the outside where maybe you have lakes and trees and things like that near you. And urbanization, you've got all these buildings, maybe stuff that are less aesthetically pleasing to the eye, and you have space in those suburban areas to build those big houses that people wanted to live in, while in the city you're not going to have that space. You're going to build up. Yeah.
What was Clara's question? Can I hear it?
Why would they deem the middle of the city a undesirable area and outside a desirable area? Yes, Carter?
I was also going to say, like, at this time, the government was really subsidizing suburban development and
Yeah.
highways, which also helps boost the auto industry, more
Yeah.
money all around.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Carter. It helps them make money too. If the government is already supporting subsidizing suburban areas because they want to build highways because they'll make money off of those highways, they're going to put the white families in those suburban areas. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Comment? Nothing? Alright, so the packets that are on your desk, I ripped mine, but this is what the front looks like. Did you get one? Boom! I'm magic. Okay, so this article is called Fighting for Home, Roots of Raising the Sun. It talks about that Supreme Court case. You don't have one of your phone? It talks about that Supreme Court case for Hansberry's family that I've just told you about them fighting to keep their home. And I want you guys to read this because I want you to see how this case and her experiences will manifest itself in the Raising the Sun book. Do you have one, Jack?
What? These?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, so I'm going to give you a choice. You can either read this with the person next to you and answer the questions together, or I could read it aloud to you. You can follow along and answer the questions as I read. Okay.
Can we work along and answer the questions alone?
You could also do that. I was just trying to liven it up a bit.
You should read it aloud.
Read it aloud. Any objections to reading it aloud and you guys answering the questions as I read? Nope? Alright, that's what we're going to do. Okay, so your job while I'm reading this, rip your packet in half, or so you can look at the questions and the story at the same time. or you can just look at the questions. And so that way when I'm reading, your job is to be looking for the answers to these questions. So when I'm done reading, everyone should have answers, right? Okay. When real estate developer Carl Augustus Hansberry sought to buy a better home for his family in 1938, he settled for a turreted brick structure at 6140 South Rhodes Avenue in Washington Park area of Chicago. In doing so, he directly confronted one of the most entrenched realities of urban segregation, restrictive covenants. These agreements, signed by property holders of Chicago's white neighborhoods, stipulated the exclusion of all black residents with the insulting exception of janitors, chauffeurs, or house servants. So you should have 1 and 2 answered now. Jack, you should have 1 and 2 answered now. By 1938, restrictive covenants covered over 85% of the city, crowding its African American population into dismal, overpriced housing. City leaders at many levels framed such restrictions as a necessary bulwark against racial disharmony. However, unsatisfactory the covenants may be, declared Robert Hutchinson, president of the University of Chicago, they are the only means at present available by which members of the associations can stabilize the conditions under which they desire to live. Those who defied the covenants, writes Chicago historian Arnold Hish, face not only mere examples of anti-black animus, but the entire system of sophisticated psychological warfare, intended to keep them caged in the ghettos. Ironically, even as the covenants grew stricter, the economic situation worked against them. By 1937, Chicago had 50,000 more African American residents than apartments where their occupancy was permitted. White property owners capitalized on the great demand, at times extracting exorbitantly high rent from black tenants in violation of the covenants. James T. Burke, the prior owner of the house that Hansberry purchased, was one such landlord. He asserted that he would put Negroes in every block of that property. In the end, it took only Carl Hansberry's occupancy to set off an uproar. Predictably, the local property owners association challenged Hansberry's residency, claiming that unless an injunction is granted, said neighborhood would become mixed, both white and colored, with its attendant equals. But Hansberry fought back, using his own real estate expertise and enlisting the aid of experienced NAACP lawyers. So NAACP means National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And in the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and even today, they worked to gain rights for Black Americans. The Illinois Supreme Court ruled that since an earlier case had upheld the legality of the covenant, the issue was res judicated. I probably didn't pronounce that right because I don't know Latin. So we're going to go past it. Already adjudicated and not subject to any further decisions. On these grounds, it ordered the family to remove from the premises. Undaunted, Hansberry appealed, and the case ultimately landed before the United States Supreme Court in October 1940. While the legal battle raged on in Washington, Hansberry's family was fighting a far more brutal war from their new home. Hansberry's daughter, Lorraine, the author of the book, 10 years old at the time, would later describe how her mother, Nanny Louise Hansberry, stayed up nights clutching a pistol to defend her children from the hellishly hostile mobs, throwing bricks and threats of arson that besieged them. After 2 weeks, the Supreme Court finally reached a verdict, revising the Illinois decision and securing the Hansberry's residency. However, weary of openly addressing the racial roots of the case, the court abstained from ruling on restrictive covenants in general. Instead, Hansberry v. Lee only held that res judicated did not apply in cases where the plaintiff had not been included in the previous class action. The covenant, they claimed, had fewer signatures than required to guarantee that the class in question included Lee. Civil rights legislation was on the move, but the Supreme Court balked at taking the first step. Restrictive covenants remained fully legal for another 8 years. Thus, the realities of her family's struggle tempered Lorraine Hansberry's optimism. Her family had gained a legal victory, but only by technicality. It had cost them, she wrote, a small personal fortune, his considerable talents and many years of life. 6 years later, he died in Mexico while searching for a place to relocate his family. Convinced that the U.S. racism was so pervasive, it could only be evaded and not defeated. A Raising of the Sun takes place over a decade after Hansberry versus Lee, but the Youngers are engaged in a nearly identical struggle for dignity. Hansberry's play thus questions the nominal legal process made in that time. The poet Amari Barca, who had initially disparaged Raylan, later reflected, the Younger family is part of the black majority, and the concerns at once dismissed as middle class are actually reflective of the essence of black people striving to defeat segregation, discrimination, and national oppression. There is no such thing as a white folks' neighborhood, except for racists and those submitting to racism. Although the Washington Park neighborhood, where Carl Hansberry defied the Restrictive Covenant, is overwhelmingly African American today, Chicago remains the most segregated city in America. Musing on why the city has produced so many prominent black leaders and artists despite the troubled history, scholar Lorraine Bonet Jr. speculates that, despite or perhaps because of the raw, brutal oppression of black people in the city, there has been and still is a sort of community here. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to finish your feverish scribbling, and then we'll go over the question. Take the back part, please. One more minute. Alright, let's come back together in 3, 2, 1. Question number 1, who's got it? What were restrictive covenants? Who signed them? What impact did it have on the demographics of the neighborhood? Romeo, what do you got? Number
said
1.
Property holders excluded black residents from moving into the neighborhoods. I didn't get the demographics. Like,
So, restrictive covenants, yes, they restricted black residents from moving in a certain neighborhood. Property holders signed up. Demographics means the statistics that the city may hold about the age, race, etc. of the people who live in your neighborhood. So this question specifically means how do the demographics, assuming to race, change neighborhoods because of these restrictive covenants. So if I'm telling you only black people can live over here and only white people can live over there, it's going to change your demographics because it's going to be majority one or the other. What kinds of workers did restrictive covenants make exceptions for? And what does why does author Sam Laisman call this insulting? Yeah.
The other restrictive are house servants and the exception. And insulting because they don't live there, they simply work for the help and easily.
Exactly. So it's janitors, maids, things like that. Yes, Carter, you wanna add
It
something?
also kind of resembles the days of slavery, where they're only there to work for the white people.
Yeah, so the reason why that's insulting is because, they only would add an exception to these covenants if there was someone black working for a white family who already lived there, so yeah. In 1938, restrictive covenants covered what percentage of Chicago? Yep,
85%.
bingo, you got it, 85%. How did this impact African American residents?
Pack them all into one place.
Yep, didn't give them a lot of choice in where they can live, and they got packed all in one place. How did the local property owners association respond when Carl Augustus Hansberry sought to purchase a home in the Washington Park neighborhood of Chicago? Yes.
When you tried to buy the home, it said like the people were like an uproar, and they were mad at it.
Yeah, it caused an uproar. They said, you can't do that because we have a covenant right here. What happened to African American home buyers who defied the covenant by moving their families into a white neighborhood? And then what happened to Lorraine Hansberry's family? Carter, yeah.
Oh, they often face threats, harassment, and violence,
Mm-hmm.
and the same happened to Lorraine.
The same happened to Lorraine Hansberry's family. Her mother had to hold a gun while she was in bed at night to try to protect her family. How did white landlords take advantage of the high demand for housing, and how did they profit? Yeah.
They charged a lot more than they usually would because they knew renters had nowhere else to go.
Exactly. They charged a lot more than they usually would because they knew that the renters had nowhere else to go. What changed with Hansberry versus Lee, and what stayed the same for another 8 years? What changed and what stayed the same after this Supreme Court case? Did Lorraine Hansberry's father get to keep his house? Yeah, so that's what changed. What stayed the same though for 8 years? Yeah.
The restrictive covenant.
Yeah, so those restrictive covenants were legal and were allowed to stay in place for another 8 years. And last question. Explain how restrictive covenants continue to impact society today. Yep.
It kind of like started black people off on the wrong foot, so they were already at a disadvantage, and then it's really hard to get out of that one.
Yep, exactly. So it places people of color at a disadvantage in terms of housing, maybe generational wealth, which is often built off real estate. They're not able to start off on that foot because they weren't able to buy houses at reasonable prices for very long. And if they were, it put them in a bad financial position, $200,000 more than Mr. White, right? Okay, so now that we've gone through those things very quickly, I want to remind you what your homework is, pages 23 to 38. And then I want you to take, before you start packing up, I want you to take that index card, and on the other side of it, now that we've figured out how all these things have anything to do with our author, I want you to give me a prediction about what you think is going to happen in the book, or a developing thought that you have now that you understand how these relate to our author.
Wait, sorry for that one.
I want you to give me on the other side of that index card, or underneath what you wrote, a prediction of what you think might happen in the book, or a developing thought now that we've understood how these things relate to our author. Cards to me as you're moving out of the door. Essay due, reading due, Monday. No, Monday morning.
We already read it.
get up and then you agenda.
I'm not ready for it. How you are?
I know you guys are too.
Stimulation card.
Thank you.
That sound like Eric? I'm not stop that. Stop. You're being a sussy boss.